let me then introduce Hans Blix. Probably I wouldn't have to say too much. You know already quite a bit. But he started out as a lawyer. And then he worked for many years, I think 20 years, in the foreign ministry of Sweden. He was a Swedish energy minister. A foreign minister, before he became a Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And after that, he has been known to everybody as the United Nations Weapons Inspector to Iraq. And that is the last part of your fame, I would say. So now it's thorium, and you are going to tell us about non-proliferation aspects. Thank you, Hans.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I know that there is a very excellent participation here, and therefore perhaps I can address you by saying that Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. And I was glad to hear the Director General speak about the particle physics and acknowledging that things take time. I'm in the other area where things take time. To create some international governance in this world is also something that takes time, and all the particles are not so easy to handle. However, the subject that I've been asked to discuss is one that is close to my experience. I follow for many years what's going on in the nuclear field, but my real job has been to fit or try to fit nuclear power into the social and political context. And no potato is hotter in this area than the one of non-proliferation and the risk that nuclear energy may pose to non-proliferation. And as you will find from my speech, I think that some of this is a little exaggerated, and that we would need to see more realistic also on that aspect of the nuclear power. This conference is about thorium in nuclear power generation is most welcome. The aim, as I understand, is not to downgrade uranium that has served the world well and long dominated our thinking. It has been the feed of the nuclear workhorses of the last 50 years, and an enormous experience has been accumulated, and it has helped us to refine the technology and also to gradually develop a nuclear safety culture. Even though designers and operators are by no means at the end of the uranium road, it is desirable today, I'm convinced, that the designers and developers use their skill and imagination to explore and test other avenues as well. The propeller plane that served us long and still serves us gave way to the jet plane that now dominates. And the diesel engines have migrated from the traditional home in trucks to a growing number of cars. And cars with electric engines are now entering the market. Nuclear power should also not be stuck in one box. I have no doubt that the current uranium fuel reactors will get brothers and sisters in due course. Although we live in an era when fear of radiation is sufficiently widespread to lead, after the accident in Fukushima, to snap decisions snuffing out nuclear power in Germany, there is still room for long-term thinking and financing of innovation in the nuclear sector. The International Fusion Project in Cadarache is pursued despite its long-term perspective and high costs. Breeder reactors continue to be built in a few countries like Russia and India, and practical experience is gathered that can help us to extract dramatically more energy from the uranium fuel. In my view, lively research and development work that is pursued in a number of countries and that aims at Generation 4 reactors shows that there remains much vitality, curiosity, and expectation in the nuclear sphere. And the work of thorium is part of this dynamism and is attracting increasing attention around the world. And we heard from this morning an important announcement in the sphere. Rightly so, as the thorium line has some particular attractive features. The participants in this conference are very familiar with them, and I only briefly note that global thorium resources are assessed to be 3 to 4 times larger than those of uranium. We do not, of course, accept the populist cry that only renewable sources of energy are viable. By such a logic, we would not rely upon iron or copper or tin, etc. Nevertheless, it is a merit that a valuable resource is plentiful and can be relied on for a very long time. Further, that thorium fuel gives rise to waste that is smaller in volume, less toxic, and much less long-lived than the waste that results from the uranium fuel. Seen from the viewpoint of the environment and global security, 2 other features should be highly appealing. The first is that the use of thorium fuel can offer us a way to burn up large stocks of plutonium that now sit idle but require expensive care and protection. And the other is that thorium fuel does not give rise to material that can be used for bombs. Now, how important are these features? The risk of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, WMD, is declared by some to be the greatest threat to security in today's world. The question deserves a serious and sober consideration. Let me first explain to you what is generally meant by the term WMD, weapon of mass destruction. And let me begin with some readings of it in the lighter vein. Shortly after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, US groups of experts arrived to eradicate the WMD, the weapons of mass destruction, that 700 UN inspections had failed to locate. We had spent 3.5 months and carried out 700 inspections. And as you know, we did not find what there wasn't to find. When the weapons continued to be elusive, also for the Americans, it became common to talk about the weapons of mass disappearance, WMD. Personally, I encountered another reading of WMD. After my return to Sweden in 2003 from New York, I one day had a mail from a lady who asked me if I had any objection if she gave my name to her new cat. She wanted to call the cat Blix. So I replied that my wife and I love cats. We would be very honored if it were given our name, but we only wanted to know that the cat accepted the name. The answer came very promptly that the cat seemed very pleased and worked beautifully as a WMD, a weapon of mass destruction. Actually, that came rather close to the essential notion, common notion of WMD, that is causing terror. It's not necessarily mass destruction, as these weapons we talk about cause terror. Unlike mice, men are not terrorized by cats, but we are urged by governments and by media, and also led by our own feelings, to focus on 3 categories of terror weapons that we term WMD: nuclear, chemical, and biological. This is what we accept the definition. There is general support for the eradication of these 3 types of weapons, but the world community has so far succeeded only in concluding conventions under which vast numbers of states, including the great military powers, have legally committed themselves not to use nor to possess chemical and biological weapons. For nuclear weapons, there is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and it aims to prevent a further spread of these weapons and to achieve nuclear disarmament, but does not prohibit states which have nuclear weapons to use them. You find it therefore somewhat odd that in the conflict in Syria, the nuclear weapon states condemned, and understandably rightly condemned, the use of chemical weapons as illegal. But at the same time, they will not accept as illegal even the first use of the nuclear weapons they have themselves. When we discuss these weapons that are expressly branded as WMD, we should not forget that there are many other weapons that are particularly odious or likely to be indiscriminate. For instance, incendiary weapons like napalm or phosphorus bomb, cluster bombs, and anti-personnel mines. We should also be mindful that the real mass killers of people today are the small caliber weapons. Despite the efforts made in most states to largely disarm the civilian population, many people are killed by small arms. In areas of conflict and civil strife, of course, the number of deaths from these weapons becomes horrendous, as in many parts of Africa. It is only recently that a treaty, the Arms Trade Treaty, the ATT, has been concluded under UN auspices with a modest aim of at least preventing uncontrolled international trade in some conventional weapons. Among the three categories of weapons that we do term WMD, biological and chemical, being of less strategic importance, have received much less attention than the nuclear. Although concerns have been voiced that some deranged scientist could use a high-tech lab to develop a devastating biological weapon, we have only once experienced such a character in operation. In 2002, anthrax in powder form was sent by letter and killed a number of persons in the United States. And I can well remember it because I was working in the UN headquarters, and all the mail had to be sent to Florida for examination before we got it. So there were many parties that were empty of people because the invitations came a couple of weeks too late. Saddam Hussein did have a biological weapons program, including anthrax, but he never used it in war. Chemical weapons, notably chlorine and mustard gas, by contrast, were used extensively with horrible effects in the First World War. And although they were prohibited for use in war already in the Geneva Convention Protocol of 1925, we must shamefully note that there was not much international reaction when Saddam Hussein used sarin in the war against Iran in the 1980s and against his own citizens in Halabja. The reaction to the recent use of sarin in Syria was different. After nearly triggering a US punitive military strike, it led to a US-Russian agreed framework that prompted the Syrian government to accede to the Chemical Weapons Convention and now to cooperate in verified elimination of its chemical weapons. The Syrian drama has much to tell us. First, that although the number of people killed by the chemical weapons in Syria was very small compared to the number killed by other weapons, the global reaction to this use was stronger by far. Second, while the Geneva Protocol of 1925 and the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993 have regard to international conflicts, governments around the world took the view that the use of gas was prohibited under any circumstances, also in civil war. This was new. What we could see 25 years after the use of gas in the Iran-Iraq war was that chemical weapons had become a subject of a taboo. Since the fateful time when the nuclear weapons were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, their numbers and explosive power grew exponentially. And during the peak of the Cold War, there were more than 50,000 nuclear weapons in the world, most of them in the US and in Soviet Union. And we learned that at that time, a nuclear war could have resulted in a nuclear winter, causing the end of human civilization. Einstein said famously that he did not know how the Third World War would be fought, but the fourth, he predicted, would be fought by stones and sticks. Gradually, I believe a taboo has developed also against the use of nuclear weapons. But is it unbreakable? Nuclear weapons states assure the world that the purpose of the weapons are to deter attacks. And the International Court of Justice has declared the use of nuclear weapons illegal in all but very limited case of securing a state's survival. Even so, it has not been proved possible to persuade the nuclear weapon states to commit themselves to even to a treaty of non-first use, as I mentioned. Unlike the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Non-Proliferation Treaty that entered into force in 1970 did not prohibit the use of the weapons. The treaty may be said to rather have aimed at preventing a use of nuclear weapons by eradicating them. It reflected two ambitions. First, that all the then non-nuclear weapon states should become parties and should stay away from nuclear weapons and should accept safeguards, verification on all their nuclear programs, material, present or future material. And secondly, that all the nuclear weapon states, capable states, the P5, should also become parties and through disarmament do away with their nuclear weapons and facilitate the non-nuclear weapon states parties access to their peaceful nuclear technology that they had. Now, how did all that work out? Almost all states that were without nuclear weapons in 1970 did adhere. 3 states, Israel, India, and Pakistan, did not, and they all developed nuclear weapons. 2 states that adhered, Iraq and Libya, tried to breach the treaty and move secretly to nuclear weapons, but were stopped. 1 state, North Korea, withdrew from the treaty and has developed nuclear weapons. 1 state, Iran, is suspected by many to move to a weapon, but denies any such intention, and there are now talks in this city that may or may not lead to agreement. So, in all, over the near 45 years of the treaty, there has been an addition of only 4 new nuclear weapon states in the world. And we may note that during this same period, 4 states have walked back from a nuclear weapon status: the Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and South Africa. This is far better than President Kennedy's fears that in the 1970s there could be 15 to 20 nuclear weapon states by 1975. The world has for once done much better than expected. Even with the relative success that we can note, any further spread of nuclear weapons would raise new risks that some even hold are the gravest to the world's security. We are warned that the NPT could unravel if Iran and North Korea were not brought in line. Ideas are explored how to raise obstacles to any withdrawal from the treaty and how to prevent at least discourage states from developing their own enrichment capacity, as Iran has done, and as Japan, Brazil, Argentina, and South Africa did long ago as non-nuclear weapon states, parties to the NPT. I fully agree with the ambition to avoid the spread of nuclear weapons to further countries, and indeed to terrorist groups. Retention of a nuclear weapon capacity in North Korea and development one in Iran could lead to dramatic risks in the regions. Having said that, about these 2 cases, I think some of the general concerns we hear are exaggerated and perhaps consciously or unconsciously advanced to draw attention away from the dismaying reality that the nuclear weapon states are much more interested in keeping other states away from the weapons than doing away with their own weapons. It should not have been that way. With the end of the Cold War and the severe military tensions in the world drastically subsided, all the land masses of the southern hemisphere are within zonal agreements that exclude nuclear weapons today. Many states in the northern hemisphere feel adequately protected by nuclear umbrellas held over them by others, or by membership in alliances, or both. Countries like my own, Sweden, and countries like Switzerland and Austria that fall into neither category of alliance or having an umbrella show not the slightest tendency to move to nuclear weapons. We should be aware that it is not the NPT per se that keeps states away from nuclear weapons. For various reasons, I mentioned some of them, the vast majority of the states in the world do not feel a need to have nuclear weapons. Some may reject the weapons as abhorrent and as expensive burden that it might be more dangerous to have than not to have. Adherence to the NPT registers this rejection of them and adds what we might term a legal threshold that gives a measure of stability. States do not like to violate their agreements, so there is a threshold, there's an added value. Rather than fixing our eyes almost exclusively at the large number of states that do not have nuclear weapons as potential dangers, perhaps we should focus on the nuclear weapon states that still possess nearly 20,000 nuclear weapons, and that even 25 years after the end of the Cold War are not reducing their arsenals except for reasons of costly redundance. When we also see that the military expenditures of the world remain at some $1,600, $1,700 billion a year, as high as it was during the Cold War in real terms, we may wonder if the security establishments have not noticed that the Cold War is over. It took a famous United States quartet of elder statesmen to put the reduction of the existing stock of nuclear weapons on the world's agenda. In an article in the Wall Street Journal in 2007, George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, Bill Perry and Sam Nunn urged that the United States and Russia, with the largest nuclear arsenals, should initiate nuclear disarmament. The Cold War was over long ago, and if the behavior of these countries continued to suggest that they considered nuclear weapons as indispensable, it would be difficult, they argued, to avoid that other states emulate that view. The quartet was given much support at all levels in the United States and in the world, and if their advice had been followed, the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK would now be on a somewhat higher moral ground when dealing with North Korea and Iran. Regrettably, the drive for nuclear disarmament that President Obama initiated in 2009, and that had a positive echo from President Medvedev, ran into a wall when the chief result of the drive, the START Treaty, was submitted for the consent of the US Senate, and obtained this consent only with the highest difficulty, and with Obama promising expenses on the order of $80 billion to the nuclear military sector. Since then, there has been progress regarding the security of nuclear material in the world and nuclear equipment, which is welcome to prevent any attempts by terror groups and others to make dirty bombs that do not produce nuclear explosions but spread radioactivity and terror. There has been some progress. Apart from that, not much really in the field of disarmament. For the rest, there is really stagnation at the present time. The Geneva Conference on Disarmament is going now into its second decade of coma. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that was adopted in 1996 is not ratified by the US, China, and others. And not even tactical nuclear weapons have been removed by NATO and Russia from the European sphere, although they appear to have no military significance at all. Are there no rays of hope in this disarmament situation? Yes, the agreed framework that Foreign Minister Kerry and Lavrov recently attained in this city was not only highly constructive in itself, but could also inject some hope that the US and Russia will seek to partner further to end the civil war in Syria. Let us hope it was also, shall we call it, a mini reset to get them to a road starting significant nuclear weapons reductions. Perhaps the ministers of finance around the world should unite and tell their governments that there are better ways of using the $1,600 billion a year than buying and maintaining hardware that will be obsolete in 20 years' time. For instance, to counter budget deficits, of which we have heard a good deal, and to defend the planet, about which we also hear a good deal. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman and Excellencies. The civilian nuclear community must do what it can to help reduce the risk that more nuclear weapons are made from uranium or plutonium. Although it is enrichment plants and plutonium-producing installations rather than power reactors that are key concerns, this community, this nuclear community, can and should use its considerable brain power to design reactors that can be easily safeguarded and fuel supply organizations that do not lend themselves to proliferation. I think in these regards, the Thorium community may have very important contributions to make in the future, and I wish you well.
Any comments or questions? Yes?
Maybe I can just speak here, but for the sake of... Can I get a mic?
Mr.
Well,
Kakurkar.
I'm Anil Kakurkar from India. Dr. Blix, first of all, thank you. It was an excellent kind of summary of what's happening around us in the political arena. With your vast experience, could you guide us? See, we are technical people. We know what are the possibilities, but getting it into practice, either through the industry or through the governments, is quite another cup of tea. Clearly, industry is not going to get into thorium anytime too soon. But since this is a matter of large public interest, how can this come on an international agenda in a more effective way? And if you could tell us some, or give us some guidance on that.
Well, I think we see in the nuclear community of constructors efforts to make the fuel cycle and the nuclear reactors less easy to make misuse for weapons construction, and also easier to safeguard, or even to make them almost impossible to divert any interesting material from them. This is one way in which I think the nuclear community and designers can help to allay the fears that there will be any diversion of material. Actually, you saw the gist of my speech is really to suggest that although we have to be very alert and active to prevent a spread to further states, nevertheless, there is perhaps a tendency among the nuclear weapon states to put the blame in this corner, say this is the dangerous thing, and to give the public or the anti-nuclear people one argument, while in reality, if they really went for doing away and reducing their own nuclear weapons, I think there would be it's justified concern in that corner, and we need to work on both, whereas now it's somewhat one-sided. I think that to me, the great interest, excitement about thorium is that science is broadening its eyes. I see this look at the same with Generation 4, that this is broadening the interest. And that's why I talked about the diesel engine and about the jet planes. It's not just one box, but broaden it. And I was struck during my career at the IAEA to see how much was going on in the world. And now even more on the Generation 4. It's true that some of this may take a long time, but there are also changes that come earlier. And above all, I think that vis-à-vis the public, we know that we have the main concerns, or the main thing that makes people hesitant are the safety in the first place, is the taking care of the waste as the second one, and it's non-proliferation as the third one. And I think the world has done very much on the safety issue, and we know that the biggest accidents or biggest causes of death in accidents are hydropower, when big dams burst, etc. The public is not so much aware of that, but that's the reality. So the safety is something that has improved very much with the self-safety culture, and will continue with your help. And the waste issue as well is one that I remember many years when I started my interest in nuclear power, they said that the nuclear industry is like an airplane that takes off and they doesn't know where to land. Well, I think we know very much where to land, and I know the place in Sweden where Forsmark, where they are planning to have the final disposal site, and it's a big community into which I belong myself, and which has wanted to have it. They have invited the industry to put the waste there. So it's a political problem. It's not a technical problem. But I think that a vast number of people still say, 100,000 years, you know. I mean, how can you take responsibility for things that are radioactive 100,000 years? And I say, well, I mean, it's reducing radioactivity and it's very safe. There are technical solutions. Moreover, for my part, I'm a lot more worried about the climate and the temperature and the time of my grandchildren than I am about my descendants 100,000 years from now. But it doesn't help. People say, no, 100,000 years, how can you do that? And if there are ways in transmutation, or if there are other ways that you can make this much shorter, and I think thorium is one such, it's a very attractive feature. I think the public is in a situation where some are religious about it, and there's no use to try to persuade them. But a vast number of people are hesitant about nuclear power. And I think they remember the accidents that happened, they think of the waste, and they would like to see something new. Some new animal, some new particle on the stage. And I think that's something that thorium, with time, might do. But there are other particles that are creeping around also. And I appeal to all of you who are in this game to utilize your strength in innovation and imagination to take us forward. And I, for my part, will try to instill some balance of judgment on the question of proliferation, because I think that it's somewhat distorted. Serious, but it's not quite as it is preached to us by many.
Carlo Rubbia.
Yes, well, I think that Hans Blix has pointed out the very important questions, which is the question of the future of stability in respect to the dangers and problems of nuclear weapons. As a scientist, of course, we know that the answers are very simple and very clear. And let me give you a few of these answers for considerations. Even assuming the fact that when it comes from physics to politics, things get much more complicated and more difficult to be exercised. Let me give you 2 points of reference in order to bring down this concern to a very significant level. First of all, there are 2 forms of nuclear weapons, the plutonium and the uranium. The plutonium is a very complicated one because there's a whistle factor, because of many reasons, but uranium is something extremely easy to make, and enriched uranium could be used to make a bomb almost in a, let me say, in a trivial way, without having the need of complicated institutions and laboratories capable to generate it, because you just have to put a gun structure and they will work quite efficiently. This is particularly important and serious when it comes comes to terrorist actions or some kind of community of people which might decide to use a nuclear argument of some kind to produce a major disaster, major deterrent. Now, there is a very large amount of enriched uranium. Enriched means more than 20%. And most of this uranium is also used for civil application. For instance, many boats and ships, for instance, the ships in Russia in the North Sea, they all use enriched enriched uranium. It seems to me, and there has been an attempt to be made, actually Sweden was involved into this, of trying to reduce the activity of the enriched uranium, at least in the part relative to non-military and non-governmental applications. And this is now a standstill. It would seem to me that we could passively insist that the enriched uranium should be banned quite efficiently. It will not hurt the basic structure, but it will provide a much reduced risk for having some kind of a major disaster. The second remark has to do with the fact that there is 20,000 nuclear weapons still around. Now, everybody knows that these the Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear weapons were very heavy. For instance, they were so heavy that the airplane at that time used to carry the 5-kiloton bombs of Hiroshima, which is a relatively small bomb by today's standards, have been necessary to carry it to the position. This was coming from the fact that a single fission bomb is very complicated to build. Now, today's bomb are all fission fusion. They carry also not only fissile material, but they also carry some tritium. Now, it is quite clear that tritium is therefore necessary. For instance, to give you an example, today a bomb is producing 5 kiloton per kilogram. 5 kiloton per kilogram means that a 200 kiloton bomb can be sitting in the trunk of my car. This is a tremendous gain, which is coming from the fact to have added to the thermonuclear situation the possibility of adding tritium. Now, the question we can ask, and this is a physicist's dream, which I don't think will never happen, unfortunately, but I put it forward anyway, is to say, let's outlaw tritium. Now, what will happen to outlaw tritium? Not very much. I think some people in the fusion may have some difficulty with that, but I am convinced that Hitler and tritium are not really the best form of fusion that one can have. But anyway, tritium is decaying with a lifetime of 12 years. So if you don't do anything about tritium, 12 years later you have half of the bombs. Another 12 years after that, you're going to get a quarter of the bombs, and so forth and so on. So there will be a very effective way to knock down, in a clearly definable way, the end of the Cold War and the consideration associated with it. So my suggestion is, if we want to stop tritium, the damage to the scientific community, the danger to the community at large will be very small. But the difficulties in continuing that kind of nuclear deterrent will be falling out exponentially. That seems to be a kind of a dream which I'd like to put for your attention. Thank you.